It's a riff that both every budding and seasoned guitarist wants to master. The opening notes to Stairway to Heaven are iconic, and the Led Zeppelin song has earned the band somewhere north of $500 million in royalties. The trouble is, a band called Spirit is attempting to block the track's re-release after claiming their late guitarist, Randy California, should be given a writing credit on the 1971 track. They and others say Stairway's famous picked guitar riff, written by Jimmy Page, closely resembles the guitar part on their 1968 song Taurus. Spirit bassist Mark Andes reckons Led Zeppelin would have heard the song when the two bands were on tour together in the late 1960s. Nevertheless, songwriters have over the decades brought successful legal challenges to the group and its label, forcing them to pay royalties and add credits to songs they claimed as their own. However, there are only so many musical notes, chords and riffs that a person can string together into a song. So, over the course of decades, there's bound to be a little borrowing here and there. But when does this lurch into the realm of plagiarism? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Johnny Sharp. He's a music writer for Mojo and Q magazines, among others. Also here is Andy Milmore, head of litigation at Harbottle and Lewis, and he's acted for music companies, book publishers, as well as many other clients. Also on the line, Chris Fielden, who is a writer, and Joe Bennett, who is a forensic musicologist at Bath Spa University. He's also the head of the annual UK Songwriting Festival. Joe, you have a guitar there. Can you play us the two songs, and let's have a listen to the differences and the similarities?
Okay, well, the whole issue basically hinges around around about a 4-bar piece of music played using a descending minor chord pattern. So this, as everybody knows, is the guitar part from Stairway to Heaven, goes like this. And the track Taurus by Spirit has a similar descending progression, and this is the issue. And so on.
So, as a forensic musicologist, it sounds very similar, although there's a lot of aspects to that song, including a lot going on at the end of the song. Do you believe he copied that?
Yes, I believed he copied it. I think there's pretty much no question about that. It's a riff he had access to, it's a riff he'd heard recently, and it's not the kind of thing that would be terribly similar through coincidence. The issue is not whether it was copied, the issue is whether the thing being copied was in fact owned by Randy California in the first place. Can you copyright A minor descending chromatically in half bars?
Maybe I should put that to Andy. Can you do that?
Actually, I'm not sure that I completely agree with the way Chris has characterised the question here, because I think it's pretty clear that any musical work, any literary work, which it's a fairly low threshold of originality, does belong as a matter of copyright to whoever created it. If it is entirely commonplace and standard and gone before, then there's nothing new and original. But once you hit that low threshold, you're the copyright owner in that work. And then the question becomes two questions. One is, was there, as a matter of fact, copying? From what we know of the evidence in this case, it's suggestive of the fact that there could have been copying, or maybe subconscious copying, a concept that was recognised in the George Harrison My Sweet Lord case, where it was found that Harrison didn't know that he was copying, but nevertheless he was subconsciously. So let's assume that Randy California gets there on that. And then the question is it a substantial copy? And that's the legal test. Is there a substantial reproduction here? And then you start getting into quality questions about what has been taken, what has been saved, and what's been reproduced. It's actually a very difficult question. I think the original could well be owned by Randy California, notwithstanding that it is a descending minor chord pattern, because it's the particular descending minor chord pattern in which his copyright subsists. Has that been taken or substantially been taken by somebody else?
Chris, the song there, My Sweet Lord by George Harrison, was invoked, and he always argued that although he had to pay out something like £1 million, the essence of a song depends on its performance, its mood. It's not just restricted to what's written on a piece of paper. It's not quite cut and dried as to ownership of a melody, is it?
With that Led Zeppelin example, to me it sounds way too similar to be regarded as just gaining inspiration. The Randy California version actually sounds like a Led Zeppelin song played wrong. And I know it's Jimmy Page that has opposed to have copied it. I think the line should be drawn where getting inspiration is a theme or a feeling, but when you actually take the riff of the song, I think personally that should be regarded as plagiarism.
Johnny, you've met a lot of musicians. Has any admitted to you that they've copied something or stolen something?
The only people that have really been sort of open about it, someone like Noel Gallagher was always very, very open about like, I like that, I'll have that. And he got nailed for it actually over a song which was actually left off their second album, which was a very similar to Uptight by Stevie Wonder. It was originally included on What's the Story, Morning Glory, and had to be taken out.
Well, they settled for $500,000 on the track Shaker Maker, which...
that's a different one, yeah.
The Australian pop group New Seekers said it sounded a bit too much like I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing, and that became a Coca-Cola advert and so on.
Well, this is the thing. That was one where he deliberately included a snippet of that as a sort of parody, a pastiche of that. And yeah, he was consciously doing that, and he knew he wasn't trying to hide anything in that sense, which doesn't make it right necessarily. Of course, there's not many musicians do it. It's incredibly common for musicians to be accused of it. You look at any Amazon review of an album and someone will say, I can't believe that they get away with this track. It must be obvious to anyone with ears that this is a complete rip-off of this other track. Well, everyone thinks they hear sort of echoes of another track. And a lot of the time musicians hear that. A few years ago, Joe Satriani, the rock guitarist, sued Coldplay because he claimed that they had taken a little snippet of melody from one of his endless, self-indulgent guitar noodlings.
If I Could Fly, it was called.
You listen to it, and really it was like, mate, you're dreaming. This is a man with like a lot of musicians, has a very large ego and believes he doesn't get the credit he deserves. He sees a band like Coldplay who get a certain amount of critical acclaim, although not everywhere.
And probably not from you. But
Yeah. No, I quite like them actually, but a lot of critics don't. Anyway, but Satriani obviously looked at that and thought, I see my influence everywhere. They're all ripping me off. It's more in his head, perhaps, than reality. As regards the Led Zeppelin one, actually, if it hadn't been Jimmy Page doing this, I might have been prepared to say, well, yeah, it is just a minor chord. It's not an uncommon pattern of chords, the descending pattern of minor chords, and even the finger picking, the sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 is hardly uncommon in the folk tradition. Or the fact is, Jimmy Page has form, a lot of form, when it comes to appropriating other people's work. I mean, whether that would count in the court of law, of course, is highly debatable, no doubt.
Joe, just referring to that Joe Satriani versus Coldplay case, Coldplay said that any similarities to their track Viva la Vida with If I Could Fly by Satriani were entirely coincidental and just as surprising to us as to him. I suppose a lot of songwriters, really, a lot of it is subconscious.
Well, coincidences can take place, and in the case of the Joe Satriani track, I think that idea, that's starting on a minor ninth chord with a melody, which was, and then over the C chord. That was the melodic fragment that he was picking up on. But my personal view is it's not beyond the realms of coincidence that two composers separately could come up with what is a relatively simple harmonic and melodic idea over two phrases. The challenge with this kind of issue, and particularly the Randy California issue, is that everybody hears music subjectively. When a listener hears a piece of music, they're listening to quite a lot of information going into their brain. They're hearing not just the things that musicologists write about, typically melody, harmonic context, i.e. the underlying chords and that which can be notated, but they're also hearing the production, they're hearing the instrumentation. So, for example, had I played you the Randy California track using a brass band arrangement, it would be technically the same composition and the same piece of intellectual property in terms of music publishing, but it would sound completely different because it would be played by a brass band. So the reason that a lot of people hear similarities can be influenced by something as simple as instrumentation. And because I'm sitting here with an acoustic guitar and played both examples on the same acoustic guitar back to back, that rather enhances their similarity as compositions in terms of listener perception.
Chris, Paul McCartney made the point that a good artist borrows, a great artist steals. That makes the Beatles great artists because we stole a lot of stuff. He admits to having a lot of different influences and perhaps influences beyond his control.
The Beatles in particular came up with very, very original songs for their time and had a very unique sound. While they might borrow ideas or get influence from rock and roll and other stuff that was around at that time, they definitely put their own stamp on it. I don't think you could regard what they did as plagiarising. It was taking influence and producing original music.
And on that point, Joe, just back to you, McCartney, he woke up one morning, he said he was sure he had heard the melody that was in his head. He thought he had heard it before, and he recorded it as yesterday. It turned out that the song that he thought he was copying was an original, so even musicians don't know quite how they do it.
This is it, and a lot of my academic research is exactly that, investigation into the psychology of the creative process, exactly how do people come up with melodies. There's a lot of romantic mystery attached to it in the mainstream media, and of course songwriters maybe have a bit of a vested interest in mythologizing the process in that way. Every creator of music has heard previous music and is creating new material in that context. So when I interview songwriters, they tell me that it happens all the time, that they accidentally, inadvertently, or even deliberately compose fragments for their own song that are taken from other songs. But normally that avoidance of plagiarism is a normal part of the creative process. You just go, oh, that sounds a bit similar, I'll tweak it until it doesn't.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London, with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing musical plagiarism with Johnny Sharp, Andy Milmore, Joe Bennett and Chris Fielden. What about the legal definition, Andy? I mean, how blurry are the lines between plagiarising and inspiration? I mean, what's the legal difference?
The issue that we come across again and again is the dichotomy between an idea and the form of expression of an idea. And you see that in all forms of copyright works. It's not just music, but at what point is what's been taken the inspiration as against down at a level where it's the particular way in which that idea is expressed. It's a real problem for the courts to grapple with any particular case, and therefore it's a real problem for artists and music companies when they're looking at issues like this. Just let me very briefly read some words from Learned Hand, who's an American judge. He looking at whether a film script was copied from or was inspired by a play. What he said was this: there's a point in the series of abstractions where they're no longer protected, since otherwise the playwright could prevent the use of his ideas, to which, apart from their expression, his property is never extended. So that's okay. So then he answers your very question, Brendan. He says, nobody has ever been able to fix that boundary, and nobody ever can. You know, helpfully, the answer is
that it's still blurry.
It is always going to be fact and context specific.
Right.
It's very blurry, and that's where it comes back to what is the evidence. And we will be looking at, if, for example, the Led Zeppelin case were to go to trial, we would be looking at opportunities for Jimmy Page to have heard instances where we know he was there listening, before we get to the question of Joe or other forensic musicologists saying, look, actually, when I look at this from my scientific approach, I can't really see this was coincidence because the differences are so unique and special. I have to conclude or infer that there was direct copying, consciously or subconsciously.
But what about unintentional? Is that a defence?
I think the answer is, I wasn't aware, is probably not a defence. And that's, again, it's an American case, but there was English litigation following. That's the George Harrison decision, that a court can find that you were copying and reproducing, and that's the test. Were you, as a matter of fact, copying without intending to, maybe even without realising? And the answer seems to be, yes, you can. You know, you've got to have pretty compelling evidence to show that particular track was around so much and you'd heard it so often that it was somewhere there in the back of your mind that you'd be regurgitating it without even realising. But actually, it could be the case, and it's not a defence then.
Johnny, I guess certain musicians have different attitudes to this. I mean, I read this interview that Tim Rice gave, and he said that when he had melodies and lyrics stolen, he was quite flattered by it. It didn't bother him. I suppose he doesn't really need the cash. Others are a bit more prickly. Dr. John made the point that you can't copyright the blues, you can't copyright a title, and that Led Zeppelin are a bit unlucky. Their music's blues-based. Many blues songs are similar.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and when you combine a musical pattern and also a lyric, which quite often Led Zeppelin have done, then that's when you haven't really got too much of an argument. Again, it was something Noel Gallagher has done several times. I think the song Whatever goes, I'm free to do whatever I want. Mm-hmm. And Neil Innes of the Bonsai Dog Doodah Band said that he basically stole that from I'm Free to Be an Idiot, which went, I'm free to be an idiot. As far as I know, Neil Innes now has a credit on that one, along with the other ones that Noel Gallagher's given credits away to. If Noel Gallagher was going to steal the melody, da 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 da, you might have got away with that, but to actually steal the first two words of, then really you're in trouble. But I agree, it's very difficult when it's just the melody. But even on that Spirit one, I think you could argue there are a couple of notes difference.
Chris, there was a big case in the 90s, a song by The Verve, Bittersweet Symphony. Well, it was their biggest hit. They had to pay out considerable royalties on that. It was a sample that they didn't get clearance for. But those kinds of cases are quite rare, aren't they, Chris?
So far as I know, yeah, they don't come up very often. I mean, most times when you come up with a song that you want to actually borrow a part of, then you'd approach their publisher and actually ask permission to do so. I mean, I've done that before in bands I've been in. We did a cover of Mr. Sandman, which is obviously a very old classic song, and we approached the publishers and they approached the writers and they gave us permission to use it.
What was their reaction to your asking for their permission? I mean, do you think there's a general reluctance to release that, to allow you to do that?
They were really welcoming with it. We basically did a cover of the entire song, but did it in a very different way to the original. Because obviously the original's all very happy-clappy, and we were doing a kind of darker version of it. So we sent them the recording of it, and they wrote back and said, yeah, you've got permission to use it, and they would get a percentage of royalties from it.
Was there any kind of question in your mind that if they didn't like it, retrospectively they could withdraw their permission? Or
we had to approach them. If they'd have said no, basically we wouldn't have been able to release the song.
Why do you think, Andy, that some songwriters are quicker to reach for the lawyers than others, though?
I think there's probably two reasons. One is because they actually genuinely believe their artistic integrity is being undermined. So that's the pure artistic reason. And the other, to be honest, is financial. You know, some of the things we've been talking about show why that is, because once you get into something which on the face of it has a degree of similarity, there's always going to be a risk that one way or another there's a copyright infringement finding. Obviously there are a number of cases that have gone to trial and people know about, but there's an awful lot more that never have. Some of them we've talked about here, and there are some urban myths around, but most cases get resolved, and they normally get resolved with a co-credit and some payment.
But it's an expensive business to take it to court, isn't it? And that's probably why people would be reluctant to, unless they really had the resources to do it.
It's an expensive thing to do as a claimant, and it's an expensive thing to defend as a defendant. And I hate to say it being a lawyer, but it is one of the areas where typically the people who really succeed are the lawyers, and therefore it lends itself to early resolution.
I suppose an added dimension, Johnny, in this particular story is that Randy California struggled financially for most of his career, playing in bars and stuff like that. And here he sees a song that he felt was his, and earning more than $500 million.
Of course, dollars. Yeah. If you feel that you've never been given your due, I think that's what happened partly in the Joe Satriani case. I feel he felt, that he was only really recognised within sort of metal circles, and he probably felt that he deserved more recognition. But I do think there's a difference with the Verve thing, for example, where I think actually now Alan Klein, the former Rolling Stones manager, now takes 100% of the royalties from that song just because of that one snippet. Because obviously he's an absolutely a very stubborn negotiator.
Do you think that's fair?
Probably not, to be fair, no. It isn't, but that's what happens. That's what you risk. If you use a sample and don't clear it, that's what happens. Because it also, a similar problem happened, and it really changed the nature of sampling in hip-hop when De La Soul released 3 Feet High and Rising. They used a sample of, I think, the Turtles. It was like a late 60s band. They used a small sample of that, I think, and didn't clear it. And because of that, the law really clamped down on sampling. and then their second album had way less samples. It meant that the whole sampling culture in music was quite sort of clamped down, because that album really benefits from having loads of really weird and wonderful samples all over it.
But sampling was in its relative infancy
Of course,
back in 1989.
Exactly, and after that, people couldn't be quite as free and easy with it, and they had to, and people were really, a lot more risk averse.
So with samples, Andy, that's a different ball game, isn't it? You have to just get direct clearance if you're going to use it.
Well, I think today the vast majority of sampling is licensed, and as you and Johnny have said, 25 years ago, in its infancy, there was a view that if you only took a small piece, you didn't need a license because it wasn't an infringement. So back to what I said earlier, looking at legally, is this a substantial reproduction? So you had people looking in the 80s saying, well, I've got a 4-minute track here and I only want to take 5 seconds or 8 bars or whatever it is. That's a tiny percentage, so that can't be a substantial reproduction. It wouldn't be an infringement. I don't need a license. And then what the court does is to look at it and say, hang on, it's not that simple. You know, over my career in a lot of different industries, there are so many urban myths out there. There's a 3-second rule, there's a 5-second rule, there's an 8-second rule. In advertising agencies, there's a rule that if you've made 4 changes from your inspiration, you haven't infringed a copyright. And of course, none of these rules exist because it's down to the particular case. Is this substantially a reproduction of the original?
Joe, borrowing, stealing, reworking, adapting, I mean, they're an essential part of any artist's trade, in particular musicians. I mean, if a song does have many sources of inspiration, do you think that detracts from its originality?
Well, it's all in the ear of the listener, isn't it? It's dependent on the way people receive it. To some people, things will sound very similar, to other people not. And it was really great to hear Andy there talking about the urban myths, because as someone working in a university context and dealing with a lot of students who are working up new creative portfolios, all of those myths are absolutely true, and I've heard them both hundreds of times. You know, I'm allowed to sample 2 seconds, aren't I? I'm allowed to sample 5 seconds. I've even heard some professional composers say 7 notes can be stolen, but 8 notes can't. And of course, melody is much more complex than that, because melody is not just what pitches you choose, it's where you place them rhythmically in the bar. These myths are still passed around musicians, even though the idea of a substantial part, as enshrined in law, is really straightforward to explain. As Andy says, it's qualitative, not quantitative.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing musical plagiarism. With me in the studio is Johnny Sharp, the music writer for Mojo and Q magazines, Andy Milmore, head of litigation at the firm Harbottle and Lewis. On the line, we have the writer Chris Fielden and Joe Bennett, Dean of the School of Music and Performing Arts at Bath Spa University. Chris, you've been in bands. I'm just wondering, when you write songs, do you ever have an element of doubt once pen is put to paper, once you've written something? Do you think, gosh, I hope this hasn't taken too much from some other artist?
I probably don't worry about it as much as I should, to be honest. If you're worrying about that, it kind of takes you out of the creative mood, and then you don't come up with a decent song. We were in the situation once where the guitarist came to us and said, oh, look, guys, I've got this brilliant riff. And he played it to us, and we were like, oh, my God, that's fantastic. Started jamming it and realised it was actually a note for note, it was a Deep Purple riff. So I think sometimes subliminally you do take this stuff on, but usually you'd recognise the fact that you've done it.
Did you change the riff, or did you just throw that idea away?
We had to throw it away because it was literally identical in a slightly different key. But, 99% of the time, the stuff you come up with is really original. You look at Status Quo and people like that who say they make their living off of 3 chords and stuff like that. There are so many. In fact, I was watching a really good video on YouTube the other day by a comedy band in Australia, and they basically strung together 4 chords and sang about 100 different songs over the top of these 4 chords. So that kind of illustrates the fact that you are limited in music. There are only so many notes, there are only so many patterns you can come up with, and it kind of illustrated how many big hits use the same kind of fundamental structure. But I think what you do as a band is put in your own influence and your own kind of feeling.
Chord loops are extraordinarily common. I blog annually for my sins about the Eurovision Song Contest, and I like to count the number of chord loops that are in there. A chord loop is usually 4 chords, and the 1-5-6-4 riff, which is this one, And it's so many songs, as the Australian band Axis of Awesome have pointed out. It's You're Beautiful by James Blunt, it's With or Without You by U2. It's really just the framework that we're hearing. It's just the underlying harmony, the melody and the lyrics, the things that really make a song original and unique, are obviously different in each case. It's just those chords that are the same. And as far as I'm aware, no one's ever asserted ownership of purely a 4-chord loop.
Just on the lyric side of things, I mean, what about proving stolen lyrics?
I think it's typically easier to prove. You see it less often, and Johnny gave the example of where similar lyrics will help to prove a case of copying of the whole thing. You know, the cases that there have been, again, have a fairly low threshold. There was the Robbie Williams, Woody Guthrie, Loudon Wainwright track a few years ago, where the original line, every son of God gets a little hard luck sometimes, especially when he goes around saying, here's the way, was infringed by, I suppose, even the son of God gets it hard sometimes, especially when he goes around saying, I am the way. Now, that was, you could say, yes, he clearly took something from the original. It was intended to be a parody. It was very few words. It was a pretty low threshold literary work in the first place, and what came out was actually different. That's an infringement. So, you know, people know this, and I think it's easier to avoid with words. And the subtlety and nuances of music mean that there's a lot more there that you can be taking, you can be influenced by, or you may not be taking. Words, you know, are much more black and white, really.
And Johnny, just finally, I mean, I guess perhaps some musicians might feel differently as to how the music would be used. I mean, let's say it is plagiarized or whatever, and it's used in a butter commercial, yes, or it's used by a hip-hop artist, or something quite cool.
I've seen quite a few adverts where you can tell they've deliberately just changed one or two notes from a really well-known song and put it as their jingle, and they obviously think that that's fine. It's probably not fine. And the other thing as well about the lyrical thing, I wonder, has anybody ever sued Morrissey for his lyrics? Because they are absolutely chock full of snippets of film dialogue. For instance, I mean, it's like, you know, a jumped up pantry boy who never knew his place. Also, it's from a film. I think his lyrics are packed with film dialogue that he's taken, and also songs like Everything Depends Upon How Near You Stand to Me is from Take This Longing by Leonard Cohen. I guess he wrote most of these songs in the early 80s. But again, this is all stuff which happens quite a lot, and like the Robbie Williams thing, it's considered a parody, like a sort of like a bit of a wink of like, those in the know will know what I'm referring to, and I'm kind of cleverly reworking it, but you could argue they're stealing somebody else's intellectual property.
Joe, maybe we're getting a bit too obsessed about trademarking everything, and the magpie nature of songwriting may be perhaps affected and impacted by high-profile cases such as this particular Led Zeppelin case.
Yes, and I think case law tends to gravitate towards that which can be easily proved, which is why a lot of it focuses on melody, apart from the sampling cases, of course. And creative people take their inspiration from all of the culture around them. As Aristotle said, you can't create nothing from nothing. So inevitably there will become situations where things just become so obviously or apparently close to one specific work, and that's where it becomes problematic. That somebody says, "Well, hey, that's my intellectual property. I'm going after you." All songwriters borrow. All bands are influenced by other bands, and you can read any interview with any songwriter or band to find examples of it. It's only when it becomes a specific work. For example, Deep Purple were mentioned earlier, and one probably the most famous Deep Purple riff is Black Knight, which goes like this. And that song was released in 1970. Famously, the band were jamming that riff, and they took it from the 1962 track, which was a beat music cover version of George Gershwin's Summertime. That cover version was a cover version of a piece of music that was written by George and Ira Gershwin and DuBose Hayward in the 1930s, which is Summertime itself from the musical Porgy and Bess. So obviously it's a long way from Porgy and Bess and Gershwin in the 30s to Deep Purple in 1970. But really, I think that just shows how cultural influence and musical borrowing can take very unusual and unexpected routes.
Well, that's a good place to leave it. The tentacles of musical influence stretch wide and back decades. That's Joe Bennett, who is a forensic musicologist at Bath Spa University, on the guitar there. Also on the line, Chris Fielden, who is a writer. Joining me in the studio, Johnny Sharp, the music writer for Mojo and Q magazines, as well as others, and Andy Milmore, who is head of litigation at Harbottle and Lewis. We've managed to name check everything from Aristotle, Led Zeppelin to Morrissey today. That's a one-off. Many thanks to all my guests. This is Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole.